I have to tell you, Toni, I don't often read fiction, but I was given pre-publication copies of I'll Know You by Your Heart, Part 1 and Part 2, and I was blown away. I couldn't stop reading, and when I got to the end of your story, I was a little sad. It was hard to see those characters go.
Wow. Thank you, Richard. That's incredible, and that is actually the highest compliment that someone who doesn't normally read fiction can pay to an author. That's like giving me an Academy Award. I really appreciate it. That's great. And I might add here, thank you again. This is Mr. Richard Peters, and he is starting a magazine called The Paranormal Life. And he has agreed not only to interview me, which I'm for the premiere issue, but also he's allowing us to film this to use in promotion.
I have so many questions for you.
Great. Fire away.
I guess I'll start by asking when exactly it was that you first knew you were psychic. I know what you shared with us in your books, but I'm curious as to how much of it is true and how much of it is fiction. Can you tell me a little about that?
Sure. This is why I called it, as I did in the beginning, these are the books here, you're familiar with them, Part 1 and Part 2. The publisher decided to put it into the 2 books because it was rather long story. And basically I call it a novelization because I am writing about a past life that I literally dreamed about, and as you say, it seemed like I was dreaming about an alternative reality, and in truth it felt that way. Sometimes I would want to go to sleep so I would learn more of the story. And I would find that that particular dream would repeat as if I were watching a movie until I wrote it as a chapter.
Wow.
Yeah.
I can only imagine what it must have been like as a child to see dead people.
Well, yes. Well, there's that too. Let me elaborate on that. In fact, the best way to address that, okay, I am psychic, and I knew by the time I was, I would say, maybe 3, I was sure of it. I didn't know how to deal with it, but I knew that my grandmother, and she's very prominent in the book, was the kind of was there for me. I just knew that she would know about it. I was afraid to tell my parents. They were very, very down-to-earth people. They're both Capricorns, if anybody knows anything about astrology. And they were great to have as parents, but and I needed them, being a fire sign, Sagittarius. But Graham, who was also a Sagittarius, was kind of on my same wavelength. So I would wake up in the middle of the night and there'd be a scary person in my room. And some of them would try to scare me. And others were just pitiful. And they would make me cry. And they would beg me for help. And I was way too little to be able to help. And I knew that they really weren't real because the way that I see spirits, I don't see them solidly. Some people do. I either sense that they're there and I get their messages in my consciousness. It just enters and I know it's different from my own thoughts. And I also, when I see them materialize, they're like pixelated. It's like little points of energy. But I can see the colors that they're wearing.
Wow. And
it's amazing. They're just little points of light, but with color to them. So I would cry, and I would go, "Mommy, Daddy, there's a man in my room, help!" So my father, who was Italian, I'm barreling in, and he would say, "There's nobody in the room." He'd turn on the light, there'd be nothing there. I'd look around, well, look in the closet, look under the bed. There would be no one there. And sometimes they'd have to get up in the morning, and I'd do this over and over, and they'd say, "There better be somebody in that room if I have to come in there again." So I figured I better do something about this. I went to my Gram the next time I saw her, which was every Saturday. And when I told her, she just hugged me. She goes, "You've got it. It's passed down through the grandchildren." She goes, "My grandmother had it. I've got it." And she explained to me what it was, that it was a gift, and that as long as I remembered that I was never alone, that Jesus was with me, that God was in charge of everything, if I said a prayer and said, "Jesus, help me. Please take the spirit away. I'm too little to help. Please help me." When I opened my eyes, it's gone. And that's how I learned.
Wow.
Yeah. Oh, and actually, to really wrap this up, I think I'll read from the book, because I'd like to have that on the promotional tape that we're going to have. if you don't mind. I know you've already heard it, but this is a bit of a kind of a better illustration of the very first time that I had a flashback to the past life that I am working on in this lifetime, because the characters from there are in this lifetime and I am working through karma. And so far I've been able to hit just about every major person has popped up. So this is the first time. I was about 4, and the family was living in Newark, New Jersey, when I had my first vision, or flashback, into another time and place. I think the episode was triggered by the music coming from our radio. I was eating dinner with the family at the red and gray Formica and chrome kitchen table when it first hit me. I guess you can tell by that it was the 50s, early 50s. I was born in 47. I was burned by the Indians in a covered wagon, I blurted out. But I lived. Some of the others died that day, but I lived. My parents froze in mid-chew and turned to stare at me, heads swiveling like vaudevillians, practicing their double takes. My little brother Jojo was too busy smearing strained peas somewhere near his mouth to bother to react. And anyway, he was used to me. "What did you say, Sonny?" my mother asked, glancing nervously at my father. I could see the flames leaping all around me, and I could actually smell the feral odor of the shrieking painted Indians as they surrounded the wagon train. The canvas at the top of the wagon was burning, and I was scared beyond any fear I had yet known, beyond pure terror. I wanted my father, and he was somewhere close by, fighting the Indians, and I prayed that nothing would happen to him. I thought of my mother, who had died more than a year before, and I wondered if this was to be the day that we would meet again in heaven. My mind raced to grasp at a way to turn this situation around. I was a survivor, but even to me it appeared hopeless. Then I felt a soaring up of my spirit, and my hidden reserves of strength surged to the surface, and I got angry. And that anger triggered me into action, and as I grew angrier, I grew less afraid. If I was going to die, I would die fighting mad. And so I sprang forward and concentrated on pulling the body of the woman who was with me in that burning wagon out toward the opening. I knew she wasn't dead yet, but she was as heavy as only a dead weight can be. And I grunted aloud as I pulled and heaved her back, and then out the opening toward the tall weeds and grasses, toward the sunlight. My emotions had numbed, and I was working purely on instinct, when a young boy of about 12 darted over from the next wagon and helped me. He helped me to lower her to the ground. He peered up at me from under the floppy brim of an old stained leather hat that was much too big for him, and his watery blue eyes were clearly appalled by all he had witnessed on this day, a day that had started out to be so exceptional in its beauty. The boy composed himself enough to speak, and then he asked, "Where is Mrs. Booth's little girl, Miss Jessamine? She isn't with the rest of the kids hiding in the bushes." My heart lurched, and I grew dizzy for a moment. The wagon was now filled with black smoke. But I knew I had to go back inside, and as if being led, I leaped in, rushed forward, and groped around under the seat up front. Words ran through my head in a sing-song chant. "Little children, hide from fire! Little children, hide from fire!" I heard the horses screech, and the wagon jarred down with a metallic clatter to rock on its wheelbase. The horses bucked away to safety, and I was glad someone had let them loose. I continued to hold my breath, and I closed my eyes, too, against the acrid, stinging smoke, and then I felt a small arm, a small, limp body. I snatched that child up against my breast and escaped out the back again, lungs bursting, aching sharply for that cleansing breath of fresh air, mere seconds before the frame of the wagon collapsed around us. Sparks and cinders flew, stinging my back as I hit the ground and skittered over to the shelter of the next wagon. I felt relief as I checked the child over because she wasn't burned and she was still breathing, but in a raspy, choking gasp, and she was ghostly white. Then I shuddered and I jumped. Like the time I'd shoved one of Ma's bobby pins into the light socket in the living room, and my eyes returned to their normal focus, and there I was, right back in the kitchen. I must have looked as strange as I felt, because even Jojo was staring at me as if I had a cat sitting on the top of my head. I took a deep breath, relieved. There was no smoke in the air, beyond that of my parents' cigarettes, and I asked, "Do you think we've all been here before? Do any of you remember the wagon train?" My father turned away, twirling the dial on the radio in search of a change of mood, while my mother stood to clear the table. "You really must eat your beets, Sonny," she said, scraping plates over the garbage pail. "How do you expect to grow up tall and strong enough to settle here into a long life on earth if you don't eat your vegetables?" "I hate beets," I said. My father decided to ignore my bizarre behavior, but I could see the unspoken message in my mother's eyes, that this was something we'd be discussing later on. My father didn't have much patience with any evidence of psychic gifts. The psychics were all on Ma's side of the family, and he wouldn't have had it any other way.
Well, you know, I've been looking forward to this interview because I'm curious about how well-formed your dreams appear to be in the book. Did you actually dream the story as if there were an alternate reality you were living at night?
Absolutely, as I had said before. I think I answered that a little bit earlier, and I know that you had your questions prepared. But it's really bizarre how I dream. Now, I don't always have a dream that's like a movie, but I so often do. And I don't know if it's just my imagination or whatever. But to play to that, the way that I know that this is a past life, I had been dreaming all my life, and I gave you the example from the book of the first flashback. That was more like a trance flashback, which I have also. And I started to write them down into a novel somewhere when I was in my 20s. I had 2 children at the time. Excuse me. And I decided I'd better get back to college and see how to write a book, because my first career was as an actress, and I was doing some regional theater. I was singing in clubs. My mother was my accompanist. But I really did want to write, and my mother had been a writer, and I'd watched her do it. It was a way to channel my art and my creativity into something that was a little bit more acceptable for someone with children. So the teacher said, you have to check these facts. You can't just write this story about people in the late 1700s going west in a covered wagon. You're writing the dress. It feels very real, the time period. You're going on something you're calling the National Road from Boston to Beaver Valley. This sounds like a historical novel to me, she said, and all facts must be checked. Well, I went to the library, and I started checking, but this is back in the day, and we didn't have a great library that would give you enough information. No internet wouldn't come around for another maybe 30 years. Maybe 25, 30 years. So I went to Princeton Library, because I was in New Jersey at the time. And I went into the archives, and I looked on the microfiche, and it sent me here and there. And darned if I didn't find a description of the man who had come to Boston and led the wagon train. And it had his name, and I had changed his first name, but I had his last name right. And then they had a picture of him. And there was also a passage in there that had described his eyes as being gray, kind of eyes that could look through a man's soul, into a man's soul. And I had written that passage, that description in my book. I screamed and fell on the floor, and people came running. And I said, I just don't know how these people had lived. And I did a little more research and found out that I had so much right. There was a national road. That's what they called it. It went down through Pennsylvania and through the Allegheny Mountains, and then we had to get on rafts and float down to Marietta. I had written that. And I was not a student that would know anything specific about Ohio history. Wow. So there you go.
Well, in your bio material, it states that you feel the characters in the book from the past life story are back in your present life, playing very different parts at this time.
More about that, huh?
Is knowing that hard to handle? I mean, do you tell them who they were?
Yeah, there you go.
And how does that information help or hurt your present relationships?
I think I jumped ahead to that also earlier. I have shared it with a few people. I have told the husbands that I've had new, and I'd read the book to them, And they accepted their parts. Because I didn't tell them until they had exhibited enough of enough of the characteristics of the character in the book for me to recognize them, and they actually recognized themselves. And they were all men who would not really have believed in anything paranormal, strangely enough. And yet they felt that it was right. They started to believe and got more into what I was interested in.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Toni.
Thank you so much. I guess we'll take a little break. We'll probably come back later. Thank you.